Hi there. So it's been assumed that people with a dominant right brain are supposedly more creative. But I ask, is that really true? Is it possible for, one side of your brain to actually be more dominant than the other? So if you feel like, your thinking is dominated by, one side or the other, did you know that you can actually deliberately set out to kind of switch the way that your brain thinks and tap into your creative side? So just like you learn how to draw, which we're going to be doing here, it is possible to change certain habits of the brain, and it doesn't really matter about the science behind that. It just happens that you can control it. You can use a right brain way of thinking by simply changing behaviors and putting ideas into practice and remaining conscious of your thought process. So think about, what you do in your regular life. You've done things like to maybe try to eat better, to get out of bed at a different time of day. So does it really matter that it's not really our right brain that's taking over our thinking? Certainly not. The fact that scientists have found that there's no right brain dominance does not affect the way that your brain actually works. We continue to grow and learn and create in the same manner as we did before, knowing the truth. So in this lecture, we'll explore the two sides of the brain in a little bit more detail, just so that we get an understanding of it. And then we can go on from there and tap really into our creative side.
We are going to focus on two things, thinking about the brain and how we're going to begin drawing and processing what we see into what we draw, as well as developing eye-hand coordination and concentration through line. So first off, the brain processes visual information entering through your eyes in two distinctly different ways, spatially or visually, and intellectually. So the first and faster is the spatial process, also known as the right brain. Its primary function is to keep you informed about the constantly changing space around you by recording where and how big things are. It perceives shapes and spaces, dark and light patterns, vertical and horizontal orientation, size and relationships, and the relative locations of shapes. And as you can imagine, this is the side of the brain that helps us to draw. So the analytical or intellectual portion of the brain processes the spatial information not as visual images, but as data. So when you identify the shapes you are seeing as trees, cars, people, and so on, you're using the intellectual brain. This is the right tool for just about every other conscious activity of your life. But when you use this part of your brain to draw, the results are pretty disastrous. So thinking about how your brain processes what it sees, complex shapes enter the brain through the eyes and are simplified by your intellectual brain into symbols that merely represent the original item. So these symbols are recalled when you try to draw what you see. So additional information about these things is added to the perceived information. So as a result, you may draw a person, an animal, or an object as you think it should look instead of how it actually appears. So in essence, the intellectual side of the brain gets in the way of you producing an accurate drawing. So this can be a problem when an artist tries to use the intellectual side of the brain to create a drawing. It looks generalized and perhaps cartoonish, you might say. And this is why. So what we're going to do during this class is work as hard as we can to tap into that spatial side of the brain to create really beautiful drawings. So there are 4 ways in which the intellectual brain distorts information needed for drawing, thus causing the most common problems. So 1, it interjects previously stored data about the object into the activity of drawing. 2, it calls up early symbols created to stand for, not look like, the complex visual information it receives. 3, it creates new symbols and generalizes information to make it easier to store. 4, it focuses on surface details for which it has a name and ignores information that explains the structure of forms. So let's take a look at this drawing problem. So the intellectual brain imposes previously stored data into the drawing. Perspective is not the problem. Most people complain that they don't understand perspective and that this lack of knowledge is what makes it difficult to draw a simple box. It's not the lack of knowledge that causes the problem. What's really there, these are the shapes the visual brain records, as you can see in this middle image. It sees an object with 3 planes, each having a different shape, and not one of these shapes has a 90-degree angle. But what your smarts say is quite different. Your intellectual brain says, oh yes, that's a box. I can see 3 of its planes. And what does it know about those planes? It knows that the planes are composed of rectangles, which are 4-sided geometric shapes with 4 right angles, especially with adjacent sides of unequal length. So the issue is that you want to draw a box, but you're faced with a dilemma. The visual information does not match the intellectual information. So this problem is evident when you start to draw a simple box like this. The conflict between what you know, which is the analytical intellectual side, and what you see, the visual spatial side, is very clear. So over this course, we're going to think about how best we can start to fool the brain. So since the 2 processing tools of our brains don't always work so well together, as an artist, it's sometimes or even quite often necessary to employ certain strategies to trick our brains into seeing what things as they truly are. The way to do this is not to allow ourselves to recognize an object or thing when we are trying to recreate it through drawing. Throughout this course, we will develop methods to help our brains switch to seeing spatially. So it is said that our right brain function is artistic, spatial, and mute. This cognitive ability is able to know and communicate through affective experiences, which do not conform to verbal math sequential systems. Our left brain is highly verbal, mathematical, performs analytically and symbolically with computer-like sequential logic. And then there's this term called aesthetic, which you may have heard of. This type of knowledge could be said to be a total experience surrounding a work of art, a unique synthesis of right and left brain, having emotive and intellectual skills that deal with relationships between colors, images, sounds, forms, movements, etc. So aesthetics is this branch of philosophy dealing with the nature of art, beauty, and taste, with the creation and appreciation of beauty. It is more scientifically defined as the study of sensory or sensory emotional values, sometimes called judgments of sentiment and taste. More broadly, scholars in the field define aesthetics as a critical reflection on art, culture, and nature. And in modern English, the term aesthetic can also refer to a set of principles underlying the works of a particular art movement or theory. So one speaks of, perhaps a cubist or an impressionistic aesthetic. So you've probably heard the expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The ancient Greeks felt that beauty and harmony could be found in human form. So let's compare different types of human forms that we've seen in history. We have Peter Paul Rubens' Bacchus from 1630 to 40. We have Michelangelo's David from 1500, which is a bit of a different time period, and with Leonardo da Vinci's 5 grotesque heads. So as we might take a look at this, perhaps we would choose the David as the most beautiful form, as it was meant to be. However, I think as artists, we can find beauty in other types of alternative forms as well, in color and mark and in different ways that the composition is set up. So as we begin this class, I want you to think about the elements of art. Some of you may be familiar with them already, so this will be a good bit of a review for you. And so the elements of art are really key in creating drawing and starting out in making drawings. So these are the principal graphic and plastic devices by which an artist composes a physical work of art. So these elements are line, shape, space, value, form, texture, and color. And these are all elements that we're going to address in different segments of this course that then come together to create a fully developed drawing. So the way that these elements come together in the artwork itself are through the principles of design. So we use different ways to emphasize a form, create balance, contrast, movement, pattern, rhythm, and unity to create a piece of art that is visually pleasing to the eye, or I suppose visually disturbing to the eye if that's your goal. So you will learn to build a descriptive vocabulary to discuss the quality and purpose of the marks, becoming aware of the speed or slowness with which they were made, registering their physical characteristics. Drawing takes into consideration intellectual awareness, somatic body responses, and consciousness at all levels. It is accessible to everyone. It is literally at the tips of your fingers. Drawing plays a central role in the evolution of an artist's work. So the mark that records the movement of the artist's implement, a two-dimensional movement in space, is the most basic feature of drawing. Drawings evoke a time response, the time required to make the movement that creates the mark. Time is involved in observation, in scanning objects in space, and in the act of drawing itself. So think of the movement of your eyes as they dart back and forth, focusing and refocusing on different objects at different times as you glance around the room. So movement and time are two of the most essential features in making and looking at a drawing. So as I proceed through the course, we will also address certain terms and different qualities of mark making that you need to be aware of as you create a drawing. So the first is picture plane. You're going to hear me use this term quite often. This refers to the two-dimensional surface on which the artist worked. For you, it will mostly be paper. It could be anything that you're going to choose to draw on. But most often you will hear me saying, again, for you to address the entire surface of the picture plane. We'll be working on large drawings, and you should not be just drawing a little tiny floating image in the middle of a very large space. Work to activate that space. Then line, this is a mark made by an implement as it is drawn across the surface. An outline, this line that delineates only the outside edge of an object, unlike contour line, which also delineates the edges of planes. Then we have contour line, which is a line that delineates both the outside edge of an object and the edges of the planes, as opposed to outline, which delineates only the outside edge of an object. As we start to draw, we're going to first focus on developing eye-hand coordination through the use of line contour. This is an exercise that enhances accurate observation, drawing without looking at your paper. So in line contour, you're going to keep your eyes on the subject you are drawing. Imagine that the point of your drawing tool is in actual contact with the subject. Do not let your eyes move more quickly than you can draw. Keep your implement in constant contact with the paper until you come to the end of the form. It is imperative to keep your eye and your hand coordinated. So as you can see here, this is an example of a blind contour drawing. It's not a beautiful drawing, but maybe to me it is. I like the long quality of it, but it's not meant to be a strict rendition of what you see. It's about really developing, getting that eye and that hand working together, and the results, when you finally look down on the paper, are going to be quite intriguing. So you may begin at the outside edge of your subject, but when you see that line turn inward, follow it to its end. So remember to vary the pressure on the drawing tool to indicate weight and space, to imply shadow, to articulate forms. Draw only where there is an actual structural plane shift or where there is a change in value, texture, or color. Do not aimlessly draw non-existent planes or make meaningless decorative lines. Do not worry about distortion or inaccurate proportions. Proportions will improve after a number of sessions dedicated to contour. And the other thing is that you shouldn't be scribbling, for sure. If your eye can't move as fast as your hand when you scribble, then you're definitely not getting those two to work together. This is a slow process, so keep that in mind, and you'll see me demonstrate that soon here. Contour drawing demands a single incisive line. Do not erase for correction. Contour drawing demands concentration on the form being delineated. In effect, you are touching the contour with your eyes and your marking implement, and moving along the contour. The drawn line is a visual trace of your concerted concentration. So in contour drawing, time is slowed down. You are not recording the subject in its entirety, as in gesture. In contour, you are going from the parts to the whole. Eye and hand are one in this technique. A finished project is not the goal. The focus is on process. So we will work on blind line contour, perhaps peaking a little bit, and then full contour to really concentrate and focus on what we're seeing. So some other terms regarding line include calligraphic line. This is a free-floating line that resembles handwriting, making use of gradual and graceful transitions. Continuous line drawing, a drawing in which the implement remains in uninterrupted contact with the picture plane. Incise line is a line cut into a surface with a sharp implement. Implied line is a line that stops and starts again, and the viewer's eye completes the movement that the line suggests. So you can see that here quite well. Like this, these studies by Willard are actually quite minimal, but we as the viewer can see them as figures, even though those lines might not necessarily all be there. Lyrical line, this is a subjective line that emphasizes the artist's emotions or personal viewpoint and is gracefully ornate and decorative. Aggressive line is an emphatically stated line. That is a little bit of an introduction to different types of line and an introduction to some of the exercises that we will start to produce.
So I hope you enjoyed the lecture and gained some interesting insights into your brain and how you can continue to be tapping into your own creative self. And now we can really start to get drawing.